Coming up next on Secrets of the Dead, 1789. With London's jails overflowing, destitute female convicts are banished to parts beyond the seas. But these resourceful women turned exile into opportunity.
The ships were turned into floating brothels.
They were in a given situation and they made the best of it.
Uncover the true story of modern Australia's founding mothers. Voyage of the Courtesans. Coming up next on Secrets of the Dead. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
In 1783, the lords of the British Empire were defeated in the American Revolution. With the loss of their prized colonies, they also lost their favorite criminal dumping ground. Since 1718, more than 50,000 convicts had been carted off to the New World. America was no longer an option, so the British set up an alternative penal settlement on the far side of the world, Australia. Within days of their arrival, the settlers were battling disease and starvation. But help would come from a most unlikely quarter. A motley collection of bawdy women. These street girls, shoplifters, and con artists would breathe life into the dying colony. 2 centuries later, their descendants will unearth the story of the women who crossed oceans to save a colony and redeem themselves. This is the extraordinary tale of the Lady Juliana, the floating brothel, and the true founding mothers of modern Australia. London in 1788 was a sprawling metropolis of over 800,000 people. Stunning, shocking, stinking, the city teemed with life and teemed with sin.
London in 1788 was the center of the world. It was the largest city in Western Europe. It had the most diverse population. You could find the obscene rich and the very poor. There were people who'd collect horse manure. There were people who collected dog turds. There would also have been prostitutes, people selling their bodies for just a couple of pence.
This chronic poverty fueled a crime wave that terrified the rich elite of London. In the early 18th century, the ruling classes had come up with a brutally simple solution. They would pack ships full of convicts and transport them to work on plantations in the New World. But the upper classes would soon have a new penal settlement intended to far outstrip the colonies of America, Australia.
The great gift, of course, is the realization that Australia could offer not merely a simple solution once you conquered the business of transportation and getting them there, but also an imperially, colonially useful solution. This was going to be an expansion of empire itself.
Today, the tiny colonial outpost has grown up into a global success story. Sydney, Australia's star city, boasts one of the highest standards of living in the world. But it was built by convicts.
I've always known I had a convict in my family tree. My grandmother and my great aunt did a little bit of research a few years ago. We knew that we had Mary Wade, who was a convict, but we didn't really know a great deal about her or why she came over.
Megan Benson's ancestor, Mary Wade, arrived on a convict ship known as the Lady Juliana on June 3, 1790. She first set foot in Sydney at the very same spot where Megan arrives for work each morning. Megan has never given much thought to what her ancestor was doing aboard a prison ship, but she can now find out. The old court records of convicts tried in London and transported to Australia are accessible online.
Given name, Mary. Here we go. Mary Wade, defendant, theft with violence, highway robbery, 14th of January 1789. So court to Mary Wade. Okay, so this is actually, oh wow, this is really quite exciting. This is Mary Wade actually talking on the record in the court. So how old are you? Going on 11. She's so young. She's only a baby. She's only 11. Mary Wade and Jane Whiting were indicted for feloniously assaulting Mary Phillips and putting her in fear.
The victim of this felonious assault was also only a little girl, 8-year-old Mary Phillips. She was sent to the public wash house to fill up a bottle of water when she was spotted by 2 street urchins, Mary Wade and her accomplice, Jane Whiting.
This is Mary Phillips' testimony here. And they took me to the necessary, presuming that's the toilet. And the little girl, Mary Wade, pulled off my clothes and bid me not to cry. That was all they did to you, yes. Nobody beat you? No. Nobody hurt you? No.
Mary Phillips was left in the dark, while the 2 scamps ran off and pawned her clothes for 18 pence.
I get a sense that this wasn't something she was meaning to do out of viciousness or cruelty. I think, you know, maybe a bit of a childish prank that went wrong.
She was a little thug and a bully. She commits her crime with a 14-year-old girl as her accomplice, but it's very clear all the way through that it's Mary, 4 years her junior, who's the one who initiates it and pushes it through.
So, court to jury. This is obviously where the judge is summarising the case for the jury. Various circumstances of such a child falling into the hands of 2 strangers, young as they are, standing over and stripping her, does seem to me to be equivalent to holding a pistol to the breast of a grown person. That's a bit harsh. Therefore, I cannot state it to be anything less than robbery. The consequences of that is that they must answer it with their lives. Wow. He's sentencing her to death for a childish prank. That's full on.
The little thief was locked up in London's Newgate jail. There she joined hundreds of other prisoners awaiting the gallows. The British government was getting tough on crime.
Britain has this thing called the Bloody Code, so that by the end of the 18th century, there's somewhere between 200 and 250 capital statutes on the books, all those offences for which the punishment can be death.
The jails were packed, but not everyone was awaiting execution. Over the last 65 years, the British government had transported 50,000 criminals to work as slave laborers in America. Officials knew full well that as many as half would die in the fields of Virginia, Maryland, and New England before they had served out their sentences. But in 1783, when America won her independence, the British had nowhere to dispose of their convicts.
The loss of the American colonies, of course, is a very critical moment in the history of transportation and punishment generally. It's no longer possible to shove the convict over to the New World. They're not admitted anymore. They have to be kept in prisons. Prisons are swelling, crowded. You can hardly move in them.
The officials of the British government were haunted by the danger of prison riots and by the fear that an outbreak of disease from the jails might infect the general public. The Home Secretary, Lord Thomas Sidney, came up with an elegant solution. He would establish an all-new penal settlement on the other side of the world. On the 26th of January, 1788, the Home Secretary's envoy, Captain Arthur Phillips, arrived in Sydney Cove with a fleet of 11 ships. To the British, it mattered little that there were indigenous people who had lived there for 40,000 years. This was to be the Empire's latest conquest. The first fleet brought a herd of cows, a flock of sheep, and bags of seed. The cargo of 732 convicts would raise the trees and till the land. On modern Australia's first day, the new settlers had no idea their tiny outpost would one day become a nation. "650 miles to the south, Hobart, Tasmania, was the second city established after Sydney. Today, it's home to Helen Phillips. On Sundays, she can be found at church. She is one of the country's most senior Anglican ministers. Helen also has a convict ancestor who arrived aboard the Lady Juliana.
The body of Christ keep you in eternal life.
I'd be interested to know what was their character like, what was their nature like. Because I wonder, are there bits that get handed on? And does it help us understand who we are today? Because we have a little bit of an insight into the generations that have come before us.
There is one way for Helen to find out more about her ancestor: by returning to where she was from, London. The original papers of the city's oldest criminal court, the Old Bailey, offer an extraordinary window into the world of Georgian crime.
Thank you very much.
All Helen needs is her ancestor's name, Rachel Hadid.
Rachel is a great, I don't know how many great, grandmother of mine. Yeah. So it's pretty amazing to be holding this.
The chief witness for the prosecution in Rachel's case was her victim, a man with the curious name of Nimrod Blampin.
Now, Nimrod Blampin, I've never heard a name like Nimrod Blampin before. So it's, I find that quite amusing. In his statement said that on the 7th of June, about 11 o'clock at night, I met the prisoner Hadid in St James Park.
St. James Park, the park the Queen can today see from her window, was once one giant whore's cruising ground. By night, rich men would come from the mansions and taverns of London's fashionable West End to find themselves a woman. It was here on the 7th of June, 1788, that Nimrod Blampin met Helen's ancestor, a mischievous 19-year-old prostitute named Rachel Hadid.
Now the judges asked him a question. You were very drunk, I suppose. I was not sober, nor was not very drunk. I went home with Hadid. Sounds like he still is a little bit drunk. Did you undress yourself? Yes, I put my breeches under my head and my shoes and buckles and hat under the bed. I waked about 7 o'clock in the morning and found all my clothes gone and I was locked into the room. I could not tell what to do. I would have jumped out of the window, but I could not get down. I thought it was quite amusing, him having to fight his way out of the room. And that he was locked in. That probably hurt his pride a bit. We get to the bit now where Rachel speaks in defence of herself, which is interesting to have somebody from the family so many generations ago, her actual words about this amazing story. This man went home with me. He was so much in liquor that he could scarce stand. He told me to make away with the things, for he had no money. That sounds a reasonable defence.
But 2 weeks later, Rachel was arrested for theft. The judge at the Old Bailey sentenced the wily prostitute to 7 years transportation.
Clearly, the law wasn't going to respond in her favour. Yeah, particularly, I guess, as she was a lady of the street.
Prostitution is the norm, as it had been for centuries past. It's not stigmatised necessarily in the working class community. You'll find girls who accept a kind of free and easy sexuality, which is no very different from their menfolk.
Over 13,000 miles away from London, life for the settlers was anything but easy. They had established their camp at what is today the foot of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. 12 days after their arrival, the settlement was hit by a violent storm. The tents were filled with the sick, patients suffering from scurvy and dysentery. And the moral health of the settlement was also about to fail. Lashed by the rain, the few convict women brought from England were offloaded for their first night on land. 242 women in a camp of over 1,100 men. On the banks of the harbor, the men ravaged the women in a frenzy. Whether this was a scene of mutual debauchery or mass rape is unclear, but it compelled Governor Phillips to write an urgent dispatch to be sent on the first ship back to England. The struggling settlement needed food and skilled labor. But to save it from depravity, the sending out of more women was absolutely necessary.
I think one of the important connections between these fears about men's sexual energies left to their own devices and the need to import more women is the assumption that families, that good family life is essential as a basis for a future civilization. I mean, it is not ultimately just women to serve as prostitutes that they want women to come. You know, that a colony to progress into a civilization must be founded on family life.
To start families, Governor Philip would need women of childbearing age, and the place to find them was London. 27-year-old maidservant Rachel Turner was young and hard-working, everything the governor of a colony could want in a woman. She had been working for candlemaker Cleophas Comer and his pregnant wife Rebecca for 6 months and had an impeccable reputation. But Mrs. Comer was a jealous wife, and she had an ear for servants' tittle-tattle. The way they told it, Rachel was not just good at the housework. Mrs. Comer was livid. She raided Rachel's room and allegedly found 2 of her best butter boats hidden in the maid's box of personal possessions. Rachel was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 7 years transportation. she was thrown into Newgate Jail alongside little Mary Wade and prostitute Rachel Hadid. Over 2 centuries later, historical writer Sean Rees will show Helen Phillips what life was like for the prisoners below ground.
So I'll take you in to where Rachel would have entered the prison, which is around here. And we're going to need to take the torches out at this point. So this is where Rachel would have come in, having come off the prison cart from the bright sunlight.
Isn't it horrible?
This is her first view of it.
It's like a sewer, isn't it?
It is like a sewer. Well, we're underground here.
Yeah.
And there would have been rats and water on the ground. And this prison was absolutely full. There would have been hundreds of people here.
Today, all that remains of the prison is hidden away here, below the streets of London. Above it is a block of luxury apartments. In the winter of 1789, it was crammed with over 750 inmates, twice the number it was built for.
Some of them were here for years.
Just be dreadful.
Because at this point, there was nowhere to send them.
So would it have just been women like Rachel here, or you'd have children or men? Or
There were children here. There were men held in this prison, but they wouldn't have shared the sleeping cells.
Okay.
Those would have been segregated. But certainly children up to about the age of 6 or 7 came into the prison with their mother. And a lot of women, of course, were pregnant when they came in, so they would have had their babies in here.
Oh, how awful.
And these are sleeping cells which open off on either side.
Yep.
So bars on all the doors, obviously. In this room, you would probably have got half a dozen women sleeping, spending the night in here. And the system was, if you had a little bit of money, you were not exactly happy anyway, but you could pay, there would be a ramp here with a wooden pillow at the end, the whole width of the room, on which the women slept, half a dozen
like
of them.
a bunk.
But you had to pay for that, and you had to pay to rent a blanket. And if you didn't have enough money to pay to be on this ramp without a blanket, then you slept down here on the floor.
So someone like Rachel, who probably didn't have much money, she might end up down here.
Probably a girl of her age who'd been committing petty crime didn't have enough money, so she would have finished up in a fairly miserable condition.
You don't like to think of a relative of your own in a place like this. Another thought that I'm having is maybe Australia didn't seem such a bad place. When you're in a place like this, maybe to get out would just be a victory.
In March of 1789, dramatic news reached London. The first of the ships to return from Sydney sailed up the Thames after a 10-month voyage. It carried Governor Phillips' desperate plea for food, skilled labor, and more women directly to the new Home Secretary, Even Nepean. Nepean's response was a defining moment in the foundation of modern Australia. Condemned women like Rachel Hadid and Rachel Turner were rounded up. An all-female transport ship was commissioned to send women out to the settlement to bring stability and to start families. The ship was called the Lady Juliana. From this day on, Sydney would no longer be just a prison. It would be transformed into a colony with a future. Nepean also wrote a set of instructions that has only recently been unearthed.
The service of the unfortunate women on board the Lady Juliana will be transferred to you. Upon their landing, you will promote a matrimonial connection between the unmarried people, a measure which must lead to the improvement of their morals and is indispensably necessary for securing the general peace and happiness of the settlement.
In its hull, the Lady Juliana could hold approximately 225 convict women, but filling it would not be easy. Though there were 150 women in Newgate Jail, not all were deemed appropriate for the voyage. The government wanted good, solid breeding stock. Officials scoured the country jails. In the county of Devon, one of the women they found fit the bill exactly. Her name was Anne Marsh. Little is known about her crime, other than that she was sentenced to 7 years' transportation for stealing some wheat from a local farmer in Devon. Five hours' drive west of Sydney is a 4,500-acre farm. It is run by Anne Marsh's descendant, Delia Dray.
Well, I don't really know very much about the convict ancestors as such until my mother started researching our family history. And then that was when it was discovered that we did actually have one or two way back in the cupboard. I can understand with my mother's generation and in her family and probably her parents that there would have still been a lot of social stigma associated with being, descended from a convict, tainted blood, all that sort of thing. I don't think it matters today, but I think a lot of people are interested about the hardship that those people faced.
The manifest of the Lady Juliana, compiled in 1789, still exists in the State Library in Sydney. Delia has requested a copy.
It's a list of female convicts, their names and their ages. So, for example, Hannah Bolton, 18, from Warwick, and Mary Warren, 18, from Lincoln, Sarah Whitlam, 19, and here we have the Exeter, and there's Anne Marsh, 21. Obviously these would have been women still very much of childbearing age with their life ahead of them. Mary Bateman, a 15-year-old, Mary Lewis, a 16-year-old. It's just like grinding away here with these, gathering all these young women from all over the countryside.
The government was hand-picking women of breeding age to send out to Sydney. But just because they were of age to have children did not mean they would simply become docile wives for the men of the colony.
These were not going to be respectable mothers, they were not going to be creative homemakers, and they were not going to be reliable at all. These are those feisty women that we've met time after time in the courts. These are these opportunistic thieves with no sense of delicacy whatsoever.
It would take the government 5 months to gather its consignment of young women for the Lady Juliana. As they waited in the Thames estuary, the women were kept in miserable conditions, deep in the ship's bowels.
The orlop deck is directly above the bilge, and the bilge is the very bottommost part of the ship, and it's the drain of the ship where all the water and the detritus and the crap ends up. Stuff from the kit from the galley, dead rats, dead cats, bits of old rotting fabric, all the nastiness of the ship would find its way right down to the bottom and stay there because it was almost impossible to clean the bilge out.
What the convict women had to say about their conditions was never recorded. But Delia has found a gateway into their world. A unique memoir of the voyage was left behind, composed not by one of the women, but by John Nichol, the man who unshackled their chains.
In 1789, I was appointed steward of the Lady Juliana, commanded by Captain Aiken, who was an excellent, humane man and did all in his power to make the convicts as comfortable as their circumstances would allow.
There were not very many bad characters. A great number were for petty crimes. The colony at the time was in great want of women.
He writes about the ship, the women, their crimes, their characters, from an entirely different angle from that of most commentators, who see them as a sort of homogenous mass of badness and evil and sin, who need to be sent out of the country. And John Nichol, who talked to them and knew them as individuals, writes with great respect and great compassion.
One of the convict women, a young Scottish girl, I have never yet got out of my mind. She was as pale as death, her eyes red with weeping. My heart bled for her. I lent her my Bible to comfort her, but she read it not. She laid it on her lap after kissing it, and only bedewed it with her tears. At length, she sunk into the grave of no disease, but a broken heart.
The death of the young Scottish girl left a vacancy on the ship. At Newgate Jail, just about the only female prisoners left were those awaiting the gallows, like 11-year-old clothing thief Mary Wade. Over 2 centuries later in Sydney, Megan Benson has been combing the archives trying to discover what happened to her ancestor. Fortunately for Megan, one of the world's most valuable historic records, the London Times newspaper, holds the clue.
Here we go. This looks like the court report from March 16th. The following were reprieved during His Majesty's pleasure: Margaret Allen, John Shirley, and here we go, Jane Whiting and Mary Wade for robbing Mary Phillip of a frock. There you go. So her sentence was obviously reprieved, but I wonder why it was changed. I have absolutely no idea.
On the next page of the same paper, Megan learns how little Mary's life had been determined by the most powerful man in the country.
Celebration of His Majesty's recovery.
His Majesty was the King of England, King George III, more often referred to as Mad King George. It's believed he suffered from a hereditary mental disorder known as porphyria.
Porphyria. George III's illness, gathered from authentic sources, he suffered from pain in the head and face, became oversensitive, so he could not bear the touch of clothes or bedding. When attacks became more severe, the brain was involved, leading to giddiness, mounting agitation, excitement, delirium, rigors, stupor and convulsions.
But 5 days before Mary Wade was reprieved from her death sentence, startling news hit the streets of London. The King had officially recovered.
The King's recovery, this is from March 11th. The morning was ushered in by the ringing of bells, and the evening displayed the most universal and splendid illuminations or fireworks ever remembered.
In the spirit of national celebration, women awaiting death were pardoned by the King, their sentence commuted to transportation. Mary Wade could now be sent out to Sydney Cove. In a few years' time, she would be a woman of childbearing age for the men of the colony. On the 7th of May, 1789, Mary was ferried down the Thames and placed aboard the ship. She would never see England again.
To be transported for life was an awful sentence. And I think the measure of how awful that sentence of transportation in itself was can be found in the behavior of a whole range of other women who were pardoned at the same time. there are some 5 or 6 or 7 women who get up before the court and say, no, hang me tomorrow, please, rather than send me to Australia. Being transported to Australia in the 1780s would be the equivalent of being sent to the moon.
It had taken 5 months to fill the Lady Juliana with her cargo of women. Finally, on July 29, 1789, the ship left the shores of England and headed south. The crew did not consider the women a threat, so once at sea, they were hauled up from the orlop and allowed out on deck. Leaving the fetid air of London far behind them must have been a welcome liberation.
I think that it must have been fantastic. For women who'd been in jail for several years, it must have been wonderful for them. You've got fresh air, you don't have to do any work in order to get your food. There's food, drink and clothes supplied by the government. There's nobody beating you up, you don't have to turn tricks. You don't have to go out at night and wonder where your next plate of meat is going to come from. You are to some extent looked after.
The ships that followed the Lady Juliana to Australia in the ensuing months were run by slave traders. Prisoners were kept shackled in heavy chains below deck with very little food. But this ship had a precious cargo whose survival was essential.
The women are so valuable to the British government that they're willing to sign a contract that guarantees good food, that they're going to be well fed at ports. There's money put aside to have a surgeon on the ship so that there's medical attendance throughout the voyage. And that's in a tremendously costly contract. They never sign another contract like that again.
The Lady Juliana would crisscross the oceans, skirting the coast of Africa, head west to South America, then back east around the Cape and on to Australia. The voyage would take the best part of a year. With so long at sea, the 35 sailors were allowed to take full advantage of the 225 female prisoners in their care.
When we were fairly out at sea, every man on board took a wife from among the convicts.
The girl with whom I lived, Sarah, for I was as bad in this point as all the others. She was a girl of a modest, reserved turn, as kind and true a creature as ever lived. I had fixed my fancy upon her from the moment I had knocked the rivet out of her irons upon my anvil.
John Nichol may have treated his so-called wife well, but to Delia, it seems the women were powerless to refuse.
The men were the seamen, they were in charge of everything, they gave out the food, they ensured that the cleaning or, the organisation of the ship, it was all in the control of men.
Delia's ancestor, Anne Marsh, was the next to be selected as a wife. She was taken by the ship's surgeon, Richard Alley. Whether the women went willingly or not, there were distinct advantages to being a sailor's mate.
They'd get better food, they'd get better treatment, they'd have a nicer time on the voyage. And maybe some of them fancied these men. These we're talking about women who, most of them are between 18 and 25. The men are of a similar age. They're there for 12 months together, some of them more than 12 months. I think it would be very surprising if relationships didn't grow up between them.
Better relations between the convicts and the crew bought the women the run of the ship, as well as a new commercial role. The ship's agent had them sewing shirts to sell in the colony. But one woman would teach Rachel Hadid, Rachel Turner, and the others how to run a business of their own. Her name was Mrs. Elizabeth Barnsley. Mrs. Barnsley had been a leading light of the London crime scene. Decked out in the finest of dresses and brandishing 10-pound notes, the enterprising shoplifter had conned her way into the very best of London's designer stores. Sadly for her, she got caught.
The thing that one has to keep in mind with Barnsley is the value of the goods she's actually stealing. It's the equivalent of walking into a jeweler and palming a Rolex. She really is out to make a good living out of this.
8 weeks into the voyage, the ship arrived at its first port of call, the Spanish island of Tenerife. There, Mrs. Barnsley showed her fellow inmates that just because they were holed up on a British convict ship didn't mean they couldn't turn a profit.
The first place we stopped at was Santa Cruz, on the island of Tenerife. We did not restrain the people on shore from coming on board through the day. The captains and seamen who were in port at the time paid us many visits.
A ship laden with over 200 women caused a tremendous stir. It seems that with Mrs. Barnsley acting as the mistress of operations, the Lady Juliana became a floating brothel.
There's absolutely no reason to be astonished that the ships were turned into floating brothels. Why shouldn't they be? Sex is a way of life, like eating, drinking, living. It's not demarcated as a form of prostitution. It's not labelled in the sense that we polite middle-class people tend to label that kind of behaviour from that day to this. In the underworld, in the underclasses and the poor, sex is a way of life just as convincingly as thieving is.
As the ship sailed to Cape Verde and then on to Rio de Janeiro, the women continued their business and invited sailors on board. At these great trading ports, fruit, vegetables, and fresh produce were in plentiful supply. There was much to be gained.
If you ask why did the women go with the men, there are clearly many advantages, that they might have access to better provisions or to clothing or to cloth or to money. I think that in thinking about this, we shouldn't assume that women were either stupid or passive or immoral, that we need to look at their situation and to see them primarily as rational opportunists. They were in a given situation and they made the best of it.
Back at home in Tasmania, Anglican minister Helen Phillips knows that as a prostitute, her ancestor Rachel Hadid was doubtlessly involved.
Bits of me wish that she wouldn't have to live in that way, because I think it demeans people. But it was a different world there. Maybe, they got a roast dinner that day or something. I don't know. Maybe there are little stories of the women tucking away little special things under their mattresses and sewing them into the lining of their clothing and so on. And maybe Rachel saw that as a way that would set her up in a better position when she arrived in this strange land she was coming to.
After more than 2 years of isolation, the colony in that strange land was on the brink of collapse. With so few women, the governor always feared the men in the camp would resort to sodomy and bestiality. But by now, the colony had reached an all-time moral low. Aboriginal women were being assaulted, and in the summer of 1789, an 8-year-old girl was raped by a Marine.
I think such terrible events become symptoms or signs of the degeneration of this colony. They feel abandoned, utterly abandoned. So there must be an anxiety that this place will degenerate into either anarchy, but also into savagery.
The settlers were starving and depraved. Crops had failed, livestock were dying, and their rations were about to run completely dry. And they had made enemies of the indigenous people who could have helped them find food. Stranded on the other side of the world, time was running out. June 3rd, 1790 began like any other day. 2.5 years had passed since the colonists had seen anyone from England. Then, late in the afternoon, the Lady Juliana was sighted entering the heads of Sydney Harbour. The ship had been at sea for over 10 months, yet only 5 of the convicts had died en route. The humane treatment of the women and their ability to provide for themselves had ensured their survival. The starving colonists raced to greet the ship, convinced it was full of life-saving supplies. For the women, the voyage was finally over. Now they faced the uncertain reality of serving out their sentences in the world's most remote penal settlement. Anne Marsh faced an especially difficult challenge. She was pregnant with the child of the ship's surgeon. 7 other babies had been born on the ship. Though they had been sent out for the men of the colony, the women of the Lady Juliana did not get the warm welcome they might have hoped for. One colonist described them as an unnecessary and unprofitable cargo.
The colony is basically on its last legs. There was dysentery, there was scurvy, about half of them had the clap. They were in a terrible state, and what they needed from England was food, seed, animals and medicines, and what they got was a boatload of women. And the way that they were regarded at the time they arrived was, as one of the officers there described them, a cargo of useless mouths.
But even though there were now more mouths to feed, the Lady Juliana had brought just enough food to stave off disaster. 3 more ships stocked with supplies were just 18 days away. The colony had been saved in the nick of time.
This is the beginning of that injection that is going to see the colony go from being something that could have disappeared into nothingness to being the world we have today. They represent hope. It's a new influx of people. It's the reaffirmation that the colony has not been forgotten. It's the promise that life is going to get better.
Within a few years, the women helped turn the colony around. Though they would still be outnumbered by men for over a century, the proportion of female colonists began to climb. With the women came families, and with families came civilization. The most tenacious of the women of the Lady Juliana brought something more, an enduring sense of enterprise. Rachel Hadid, the mischievous prostitute, married another convict, Isaac Williams, and bore 6 children. In 1808, once she had served out her sentence, she left Sydney with the children, but without the husband, and started her own business in the new township of Hobart.
Here she is. On Michaelmas Day,
1823, the following licences were granted. Rachel Williams. The licence was to sell spirits, wines and beer in Hobart Town.
By 1823, Rachel was the proud owner of 2 homes and was the only woman in town running her own pub, the Horse and Groom.
I'm a bit relieved, and the thought did go through my mind, gosh, I hope it's not another brothel. That certainly has occurred to me.
Anne Marsh ran a pub, a bakery, a butcher shop, and a general store. She also started the Parramatta Riverboat service, which still runs today. In 1811, she wrote to the governor of the colony asking for a man.
Anne says here, I should have one for the Parramatta boat service. That was to help run the ferry?
That's right. She wanted a convict man assigned to her to help her run the ferry. And I think that completely challenges the stereotypes that we have about the gender order at that time.
The petty thief from Devon had become one of Sydney's greatest entrepreneurs.
She's a family woman. She's a proprietor and has been for many years. I mean, what more could she do?
I hope she got a man.
Yes.
The colony was not mired in the same strictures of breeding and class that bound English society. Maidservant Rachel Turner soared up the social ladder. She married master boat builder Thomas Moore and joined the ranks of the colony's largest landholders. In 1820, she was invited to attend an official party hosted by the governor. As for crime queen Elizabeth Barnsley, she became the colony midwife. After a few years, her name disappears from the colonial records. It's believed she was one of the few women to serve her sentence and earn her own passage back to England.
There's no doubt that these women did better in Sydney and Hobart than they could possibly have done in London. In London, a lot of them had been more or less written off. And in Sydney, in Hobart, there wasn't really the class to write them off. It was the convicts themselves who had to supply the energy, who had to be the motor of the colony.
Some women never escaped poverty to prosper in the colony, but most contributed to Australia in a far more significant way, and none more than little street urchin Mary Wade. There is one final mention of Megan Benson's ancestor, tucked away in a local newspaper, dated 1859.
We can see that she suddenly died at her son's residence, and it says that she was 87. And then in the obituary, it talks here in terms of her producing one of the largest families in the world. In fact, what's really amazing is that in her own lifetime, she produced 5 generations of children.
Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. Mary Wade, at the time of her death, had over 300 descendants. She genuinely was one of the founding mothers of modern Australia.
It's really interesting to read here in the death notice that the deceased was highly, it's really difficult to read, esteemed, as well as being widely known and respected.
Yes, I think the story of Mary Wade is a real rags to respectability story. She was redeemed in the end, you know, that the convict legacy, she overcame that.
She obviously did build a life for herself, and I guess, I'm getting a bit emotional, but it reflects what a lot of the women in the family were like. My grandmother, my great aunt, how strong they were, but that possibly comes from her in terms of her strength and her ability to get on and do things.
Mary Wade crossed the world to help rescue a dying colony. But she and the other women of the Lady Juliana gave Sydney and the nation of Australia something much more. They gave it a future.
reopen investigations of the past at PBS Online. History is revealing its forgotten secrets at pbs.org. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you.